My name is Maya Whitfield, and I was 32 the day I buried the only person who ever truly chose me. Her name was Dorothy Reyes, my grandmother, and she taught me how to balance a ledger before I could ride a bike without training wheels. At her funeral, one chair in the front row stayed empty. The chair I had saved for my mother, who never came. But what she posted online 2 hours later, and the voicemail that arrived from my dead grandmother's phone, is where this story actually begins. Welcome to Calm Drama Vault, the channel where we sit with the quiet betrayals inside families, and the women who finally stop shrinking to keep the peace. If a story like this one has ever lived inside your own house, you already know exactly how heavy an empty chair can feel. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. I remember standing at the front of that small chapel, watching the room fill with people who genuinely loved her. Former students she'd tutored for free. A neighbor whose kids she'd watched every summer for a decade. And then, sitting in that pew, my phone buzzed in my coat pocket, and the ground seemed to tilt underneath me. To understand that buzz, you first have to understand the woman in the casket at the front of that room. My mother, Linda, left when I was 6. She had reasons, she always said. Big important reasons that never quite added up when I got old enough to actually count them. Dorothy, my grandmother, took me in without a single complaint. She was 58 then, a retired bookkeeper with reading glasses always pushed up on her head, and she never once made me feel like an inconvenience. She came to every school event, every spelling bee where I froze on stage, every parent-teacher conference, sitting in a chair built for a child, taking notes in careful cursive. My mother sent a birthday card most years when she remembered. Dorothy never missed a single day. When I was 10, I asked her why my own mother didn't want me around. She set down her tea and said something that stayed with me my whole life. Showing up is the whole thing, sweetheart. Everything else is just noise. For 22 years, she was the person in the chair. She walked me down the aisle when I married David. She held my son Eli an hour after he was born and cried without any shame at all. So no, I was never confused about who my real family actually was. Which is exactly why, during the last hard months of her life, the thing that still keeps me awake is that I wasn't watching closely enough. The stroke came in February, and the recovery never fully arrived. By early summer, Dorothy needed help with almost everything. I drove the 15 minutes to her house most evenings after closing my own accounting practice. Because numbers had always been my trade too. Learned straight from her. That was exactly when my mother reappeared. Linda, who lived 3 states away, and only ever surfaced when something could be gained, suddenly flew in to help Mom get organized. She took over the mail. She took over the banking. When I offered to sit down and review the accounts, my actual profession, she gave me a tight little smile and said, "Mom wants her privacy, Maya." I pushed back. I asked to be added as a secondary contact so I could simply watch for anything unusual. She told me it wasn't my place. I called the bank myself, and they told me only the account holder or the power of attorney could discuss anything. And the power of attorney was Linda. There was a wall around my grandmother, and it had my mother's signature on it, and there was nothing I could legally reach across. I told myself she was still Dorothy's daughter. I told myself grief and worry were making me paranoid. I brought over soup and I kept my mouth shut. And I trusted the wrong thing entirely. 4 months later, she was gone. She passed on a Sunday morning at home, with me holding one hand and a hospice nurse named Renee on the other side. Linda had flown back home 5 days earlier because, and I'm quoting her exactly, she couldn't just sit around waiting. So I planned the funeral alone. I picked the readings. I wrote the obituary at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning while David slept upstairs. I called the church, the florist, the funeral home. And then I called my mother to tell her the date. There was a long pause and the faint sound of a television in the background. And she said they simply couldn't make it back in time. Flights were expensive that week. Mom would understand. I sat with the phone against my ear a long time after she hung up. I thought about Dorothy in that small chair at every school event, taking notes in careful cursive. Showing up is the whole thing, sweetheart. She'd said it so many times it lived inside me. Like a second heartbeat. And her own daughter couldn't find a flight. I told myself one empty chair at a funeral was the worst thing my mother could possibly do to me. I told myself it couldn't get any lower than a daughter skipping her own mother's grave. I was wrong about that. I was so wrong. The lowest part was still 2 hours away, already loaded and waiting. On a phone screen in a hallway I hadn't reached yet, the funeral was held on a bright, unfairly beautiful Saturday morning, the kind of sunshine that felt almost disrespectful. I arrived early and saved one chair in the front row. I don't fully know why. Hope is a stubborn thing. I set a folded program on the seat and waited for a mother who wasn't coming. The chapel filled in behind me. When I turned around once, my breath caught, because the room was packed. Former students, now grown, sitting with their own children. The neighbor she'd helped raise. A woman I didn't recognize who told me Dorothy had tutored her through night school 20 years earlier and had never once asked for payment. An entire community showed up for a retired bookkeeper. And one chair in the front row stayed empty with a single folded program sitting on it, like a placeholder for a ghost. The pastor spoke. I stood to read the words I'd written at 2 in the morning. And my voice held steady because Dorothy's granddaughter does not fall apart in public. She raised me sturdier than that. I sat back down. I looked at that one empty chair one more time, and that was the exact moment my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I almost didn't look. But I did. It was a photo. My mother at a rooftop restaurant, holding a cocktail glass, laughing with friends I didn't recognize, string lights overhead. Underneath it, in her own breezy caption, "Sometimes you just need a girl's weekend to reset." Posted publicly, time-stamped 14 minutes into her mother's funeral. My hand went cold around the phone. I don't fully remember the rest of the service. I remember sitting afterward in my car with the engine off, staring at that photo until the screen went dark. Then turning it back on and staring again, a girl's weekend to reset, while I lowered her own mother into the ground. I have spent my entire career being the calm one in other people's financial disasters. A missing invoice, a blown budget, a client crying over a tax bill. I'm the one who says, "Let's look at what actually happened." But sitting in that parking lot, I could not locate a single steady thought. I kept doing the math on the timeline. 14 minutes in. That meant she had been choosing a filter and writing a caption at the exact hour I was standing up to read her own mother's eulogy. That wasn't forgetting. That was a decision, made in real time. I was still holding the phone when it buzzed again. A text this time. From a contact saved in my phone under one word. Grandma. Her number. The number I had called every single evening for months. The number that had gone quiet on a Sunday morning when a hospice nurse pulled a sheet up gently and I stopped breathing for a while. And now it lit up my screen like nothing had ever happened. "Sweetheart, come to my house right now." I read it 4 times. My grandmother was in the ground behind me. I had watched her go. There was no version of the world where that number should be sending me anything at all. Goosebumps rose under my black dress. I looked back toward the cemetery, then down at her name glowing on my screen. And I did the only thing her granddaughter could do. I started the car. Dorothy's house sat 20 minutes outside town. At the end of a quiet cul-de-sac lined with oak trees she'd planted herself decades earlier. I made it in 12. My hands wouldn't quite stop shaking the whole drive, and I kept the radio off, and I told myself all the reasonable explanations. Wrong number. Some kind of app glitch. Someone's cruel idea of a joke. But the porch light was on when I pulled up, and the front door stood open. And there was a car in the driveway I half recognized. I walked up the steps she'd had repainted the summer I turned 14. Inside, at her kitchen table, sat a slim older man in his 70s, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, my grandmother's phone resting in front of him. Frank Delgado, her attorney for nearly 30 years, and I believe her last genuine friend. He stood when he saw my face. "Maya, I'm so sorry. I should have called you from my own number, but she told me you might not come for a stranger's call. She told me you'd come for hers." I couldn't speak. Frank set the phone down gently, like it was still warm. Your grandmother asked me to do this months ago, he said. She made me promise that the day after she passed, I'd get you out here alone, no matter what it took. And she told me to use her own phone. She said, and I'm quoting her exactly, she'd drop everything for that name. I looked at the phone. I looked at the empty chair at the head of her kitchen table. My heart didn't sink so much as fall straight through the floor, because this wasn't a glitch and it wasn't a ghost. This was Dorothy, reaching out one final time from the far side of the worst week of my life, which meant she had known something was coming. There's a box, Frank said quietly. She wanted you to have it. Part 3, the box was an old cookie tin, the kind she'd kept sewing supplies in my entire childhood, with my name written across the lid in her careful, shaking script. Inside were 3 things. A leather-bound ledger, worn soft at the corners. A thick stack of bank statements, photocopied and paper-clipped by month. And a folder holding a copy of a legal document I recognized before I could even read the title, because I'd filed 100 of them myself. A durable power of attorney. My mother's name on the signature line. I looked up at Frank. He folded his hands on the table. Your grandmother didn't trust her daughter, he said quietly. Not at the end. She wanted you to have the truth, Maya, not just the grief. She said you were the only one who'd know exactly what to do with numbers. And the only one who ever actually showed up. I ran my thumb over the worn leather cover of the ledger. I could feel the ridges where a trembling hand had pressed too hard into the pages. I wasn't ready to open it yet. But standing there holding that tin, I understood clearly that my life had just split into a before and an after. And there would be no gluing it back together. If you've ever been handed grief and paperwork in the very same breath, you already know how loud a quiet kitchen can get. Stay with me, because this is the moment I stopped being the woman who simply kept the peace. Comment showing up if there's someone in your life who always did. And subscribe, because what I found inside those pages is the reason my mother is where she is today. I thanked Frank. And I drove that ledger home like it was a living thing on the seat beside me. David was still awake when I got in. Eli finally asleep. The porch light on for me exactly the way Dorothy always used to leave hers. He took one look at the tin and my face and put the kettle on without saying a word. He's a good man, an electrical contractor who fixes things for a living, and genuinely wants the world to be fixable too. I told him about the rooftop photo. I told him about the text from a phone that shouldn't have sent anything. He sat down slowly. Then I opened the ledger. Dorothy's handwriting had always been small and precise, an old bookkeeper's hand. But these pages started strong and gradually got worse. Line by line, the letters loosening as the months went on. The early entries were simply a woman managing recovery. Good day. Renee changed the dressing. Maya brought soup, stayed to watch the news. Then, a few weeks in, the tone shifted. Money's tight again, she wrote. And I don't understand why. Linda says I've been spending more than I remember. Maybe I have. I get so tired. I can't always be sure anymore. I read that line 3 times. My grandmother had never once lost track of $1 in her entire career. She'd kept receipts organized by year in a filing cabinet in her hallway closet. And here she was, in her own failing handwriting, wondering aloud where her savings had gone, while her daughter told her she'd simply spent it. David read over my shoulder and went very still. The kettle screamed, and neither of us moved to take it off. Somewhere in these pages, I already knew, was the shape of whatever had built a wall around my dying grandmother. I turned to the next entry. My hands had steadied by then. Numbers are the one place I never lose my nerve, and Dorothy, God love her, had started keeping her own count. The middle of the ledger was where a frightened woman turned into a careful one. After her stroke, she wrote, Linda had sat her down and explained that her memory couldn't be fully trusted anymore, that she needed help managing her accounts, that she'd handle the burden for her. So Dorothy had signed the power of attorney right there at her own kitchen table. Only 3 days after leaving the hospital. Still weak enough that her signature wandered off the line. She'd signed because Linda was her daughter. And she was frightened and exhausted. And because a mother wants desperately to believe her child is reaching out a hand, and not into a pocket dot, then the entries began listing amounts. $300 out on the 4th, she wrote. Didn't buy anything I remember. $500 on the 11th. Renee drove me to the pharmacy. $40 total. That's all I spent all week. She'd begun noticing the gaps. She'd begun in her weakest months, keeping her own private tally. Because some part of the woman who never lost $1 in 50 years of bookkeeping knew exactly what she was watching happen. She thinks I'm too far gone to count. She wrote near the bottom of one page. I'm not. I just can't stop her. The bank won't talk to me anymore. They talk to her now. And underneath that, pressed so hard the pen had nearly torn the page. I gave her the key to my house, and she took the house. Not the building. Everything else inside it. I set the ledger down and looked at the stack of statements she'd photocopied. She had left me a map. All I had to do was follow it, month by month. The one thing in this entire nightmare I actually knew how to do. I spread the statements across our dining table the way I do for a client audit, oldest to newest, and I started reconciling. This is the part of my job most people find tedious. I find it honest. Numbers don't take sides. They don't love you and they don't lie to you. They simply sit there and tell you exactly what happened, and what happened to Dorothy Reyes was written in plain black ink. Transfer by transfer. Starting the month after the power of attorney was signed, money began leaving her savings in steady, regular bites. Not medical bills. I cross-checked every hospital and pharmacy charge, and those were small and separate. These were electronic transfers, clean, regular, moving from her account into an account ending in the same 4 digits over and over. Some months $1,800. Some months over $6,000. A loan here, a reimbursement there, though I could not find one single thing she'd ever actually purchased for her mother. A woman recovering from a stroke. And every few weeks her savings simply walked out the door. I built a spreadsheet the way I've built 10,000 of them. And I watched the running total climb up the right-hand column like a fever chart. David brought me coffee near midnight and didn't say anything. He knows the look I get when the numbers start telling their own story. Around 1 in the morning, I sat back and pressed both hands flat against the table to stop them shaking, because grief makes you doubt yourself. It makes you wonder if you're twisting things, if you're the unreasonable one. But numbers don't grieve. They just tell the truth. And the truth was climbing that column faster than I wanted it to. Before I did anything else, I called her. I owe myself that much, at least to say out loud. I gave my mother a chance to explain. I sat in my car the next morning because I didn't want Eli in the house for it. And I dialed her number. Linda answered bright and unbothered, still riding whatever weekend she'd had. I kept my voice level. I told her I'd been going through Grandma's paperwork, that there were withdrawals I couldn't account for, and I asked plainly what the transfers into her account had actually been for. The warmth dropped out of her voice like a trapdoor opening. That is none of your business, she said. I told her it was, because I was the one settling the estate. She laughed, and it was an ugly sound. The estate, she said, is family business. And last I checked, you were always closer to her than to me, so don't act shocked that she trusted me with the money. I said nothing. I let her keep talking, the way you let a client dig their own hole during an audit. She felt sorry for you growing up, she said. That's all your whole relationship with her ever was. You want the truth, Maya? What's mine is mine. And then she hung up. I sat in my driveway with the phone in my lap for a long time. What's mine is mine. She'd handed me the exact sentence she thought would break me, the one designed to make me sit down, stay small, and be grateful for whatever scraps were left. 15 years ago, it might have worked. But I wasn't a child anymore, and I had a spreadsheet at home that didn't care whose blood anyone shared. I went back inside and picked up the ledger again. I called Frank and asked him to explain the power of attorney to me plainly, like I was a jury and not an accountant. He met me at his office above the pharmacy downtown and laid it out straight. A durable power of attorney, he said, doesn't make you an owner. It makes you a fiduciary. That's the entire point of it. She was legally required to act in Dorothy's interest, not her own. Every dollar she moved had to serve Dorothy's care, her bills, her comfort. She could not lend it to herself, gift it to herself, or reimburse herself for things she never actually bought. Doing that isn't a family disagreement, Maya, he said. That's a breach of fiduciary duty. And past a certain dollar amount, taking from an elder that way has a name the state takes very seriously. I asked him what I could actually do. He rubbed his eyes behind his glasses. You can petition the probate court for a formal accounting, he said. That forces her to open the books and justify every transfer in writing, under oath within 30 days. If she can't, and from what you're describing she can't, that failure becomes evidence. At that point it's not just civil anymore. It can go to the prosecutor. He looked at me over his glasses, his voice softening. But I want you to hear the rest of it too. This is your mother. You start this and there is no quiet way to finish it. I thanked him and drove home with the entire shape of it finally clear in front of me. There was a legal road. It ran straight through my mother, and I hadn't yet decided whether I had it in me to walk it. That night I couldn't sleep, so I went back to the ledger, further than I'd read before, into the final entries where her handwriting barely held its shape at all. And near the end, pressed flat between 2 pages, I found a folded scrap of paper torn from a prescription pad. On it, in that failing, careful hand, she'd written 4 account numbers. Her savings. Her checking. A certificate of deposit. And one I didn't recognize at all. Beneath them, one line. If you're reading this, sweetheart, then I was right about her. And I'm sorry. I sat on the edge of the bed and read it until the words blurred together. She had known. That was the thing that undid me more completely than the rooftop photo, more than the empty chair. She had known exactly what her daughter was doing to her, and she had been too weak, too walled off, to stop it on her own. And instead of simply giving up, she had quietly built a case inside a cookie tin, and handed it to the one grandchild she trusted with the truth. She'd turned a torn prescription pad page into a key. And that word sorry sat on my chest like a stone. She was apologizing to me, as though being betrayed by her own daughter was somehow something she had done to me, rather than something done to both of us at once. I pressed the scrap flat and understood exactly what she'd left me and why. She hadn't left me grief. She'd left me instructions. With that 4th account number, I finally had the whole picture. Because that unfamiliar account was a certificate of deposit she'd built over nearly 35 years. Her real nest egg? The one she'd always said was meant for something good. I pulled the records Frank could legally request, added the CD to my spreadsheet, and watched the running total jump. She hadn't just skimmed off the monthly transfers. Somewhere in the weakest month of her recovery, while Dorothy was too unsteady to sign her own name properly, Linda had used the power of attorney to cash the certificate out early, eating the penalty, and moved the entire sum out. I ran the total 3 separate times. Because I didn't believe it the first 2. $390,000. That was the number sitting at the bottom of my column. Nearly $400,000, drained from a woman who reused tea bags twice and wore the same cardigan for a decade. Because a good sweater shouldn't be wasted. I closed the laptop very gently. Because if I hadn't closed it gently, I would have thrown it across the room. I sat in the dark and let the number settle into me. It didn't make me hysterical. It made me certain. The first person to call me the next morning was my Uncle Ray, my mother's younger brother. I made the mistake of assuming he'd be on my side. He'd always been the gentler one. The uncle who slipped me $20 at Christmas. He started soft. He'd heard I was upset about some money. He understood, he really did. But did I honestly want to tear the whole family apart over Mom's estate? I told him it wasn't the estate. I told him Linda had drained nearly $400,000 from Dorothy while she was recovering from a stroke, and that I had the documents to prove it. There was a silence on the line. And I could hear him recalculating, and it wasn't sympathy he was doing the math on. Look, Maya, he said finally, his voice thinner now. Whatever happened, it should stay in the family. You go to court, you drag lawyers into this, there's nothing left for anybody. Linda says there's supposed to be a share for me and Aunt Carol too. Don't blow that up over a misunderstanding. And there it was. He wasn't afraid for Dorothy. He was afraid for his cut. He was standing in a burning house, asking me not to call for help. in case the water damaged his half. I told him I loved him. And I hung up before I said something I couldn't take back. That was the first one to go. My own uncle, choosing a payout over the truth, choosing his sister's silence over his mother's stolen savings. I stood at my window afterward and understood something cold and clear. This wasn't going to be me against my mother alone. This was going to be me against everyone who wanted a piece and was willing to call betrayal family business to keep getting it. The one I hadn't expected was David. He waited until Eli was asleep, then sat down across from my spreadsheets with both hands wrapped around a mug he wasn't drinking from. "I love you," he said carefully, "the way you handle a live wire. And I loved your grandmother. But maybe we let this one go." I stared at him. He kept going, gentle and reasonable and entirely wrong. "It's not our money," he said. "It never was. You go to war with your mother, and it's years of lawyers. And it's Eli watching his mom tear herself apart over a dead woman's bank account. She can't spend it now. Let's protect what we have and just walk away." I know he wasn't being cruel. He was being a father, standing between his family and a fire. But it landed like a betrayal anyway, because it meant the one person I thought would stand beside me was asking me to sit down instead. "It was never about the money, David," I told him. "It's about a woman who came to every single thing I ever did. And her own daughter couldn't come to her funeral because she was too busy spending what she stole from her. If I let that go, then showing up means nothing at all." He didn't agree that night. He went to bed, and I stayed at the table alone with my grandmother's ledger and nearly 400,000 stolen dollars. And not one single person standing beside me. She moved faster than I expected. A week after that phone call, I drove out to Dorothy's house. Maybe just to sit on the porch we'd repainted together. And there was a realtor's sign already hammered into the front yard, a lockbox fastened to the door. She'd flown up, changed the locks, and listed the house before the flowers on the grave had even wilted. I stood in the driveway where I'd parked 100 times, and I couldn't get in. My grandmother's house, the only place on earth that had ever truly felt like home to me. And I was locked out of it by my own mother. There was a light on inside. I could see her moving behind the curtains, boxing up a lifetime. When she saw my car, she came to the window and pulled the curtain shut. Didn't open the door, didn't say a word. Just closed the curtain on me like I was a stranger at the wrong address. I stood there until the porch light, the one Dorothy always left burning, clicked off from inside. She turned off the light. That's the detail I still can't shake. For 22 years, that light had been on for me every time I came up the driveway. My mother reached over and turned it off. I drove home with my jaw so tight it ached. She was betting everything on the one thing that had kept me small my entire life. She was betting I'd stay quiet to keep the peace. She bet wrong. When quiet threats didn't move me, she tried a louder one. Linda called, the first time in weeks, and her voice had that rehearsed calm people use when a lawyer's been coaching them. She'd heard I was talking to attorneys. She wanted me to understand something. If I came after her, she said, she'd tell everyone the truth. That I had manipulated a confused, elderly woman. That I'd wormed my way into her house and turned her against her own daughter to steal an inheritance I had. No real right to. She said it so. Smoothly, I knew she'd rehearsed it out loud before. "You have no idea how this looks, Maya," she said. The favorite grandchild, alone with the sick woman, controlling all her money. "You throw one stone, I throw 10. She was flipping the entire story. In her version, the thief became the victim, and the granddaughter who'd shown up every single evening became the vulture. And the terrible thing is, I understood it might actually work on people who didn't know us. A jury doesn't see 22 years of school events. They see a will, a lot of missing money, and a woman standing very close to both. For about an hour after that call, I was genuinely afraid. Not of her. Of the story she could tell. Then I remembered what I actually had. Not a story. Not a he said, she said. I had Dorothy's own handwriting, dated in her own failing hand, describing exactly what was being done to her while it was happening. I had a fiduciary who couldn't account for a single dollar. I had numbers that don't grieve. Let her throw 10 stones. I had the one that was true. Frank sent me to a woman named Patricia Ruiz, who practiced nothing but elder law. And she was the first person in weeks who looked at my spreadsheet and didn't flinch. She spread the ledger, the statements, and the power of attorney across her desk and read for nearly 20 minutes without saying a word. Then she took off her glasses. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said. "In my experience, most of these cases are a fog. Someone's confused. Records are missing. It's one memory against another. This is not that. Your grandmother did your work for you. She documented her own exploitation in real time and left you an entire paper trail." She laid out the road plainly. First, a petition for a judicial accounting. The probate court would order Linda to justify every transfer under oath within 30 days. When she couldn't, that would constitute a breach of fiduciary duty, civil at minimum, meaning restitution, and because she'd acted in bad faith, potentially double damages. Past a certain threshold, and nearly $400,000 was well past it. This stopped being a family dispute and became financial exploitation of an elder. "That's a felony," Patricia said. "That's a prosecutor, and a criminal record, and possibly prison time." She set down her pen and looked at me the way Frank had. "You need to decide something before we file because a judge can't unring this bell. Once I petition, your mother is on a track that ends in handcuffs if the evidence holds. And your evidence holds." I sat in that chair a long moment. Everything I'd feared and everything I'd wanted were finally the same object, sitting right there on her desk. The road was real. It was paved. And every mile of it ran straight over my mother. I told Patricia I needed one night. I meant it. That night was the hardest of the entire ordeal. Harder even than the funeral. Because at the funeral there had been nothing left to decide. This, I had to choose. I sat at my dining table and let myself feel the full weight of it. If I signed those papers, my mother, the woman whose face I'd searched for at every school event and rarely found, would become a criminal defendant. She could go to prison. Whatever thin, mean thread still connected us would be cut for good. And I would be the one holding the scissors. There's a version of me, the 6-year-old version, who would have set the pen down and made peace and spent the rest of her life feeling grateful for scraps. That small girl pulled at me that night, believing that if she was just good enough, just quiet enough, her mother might finally choose her dot. And then I opened Dorothy's ledger to the line I'd read 100 times already. The line she'd said to a crying child, and later written to a grieving woman, "Showing up is the whole thing. Sweetheart." I finally understood I'd had it backwards my entire life. I thought showing up meant sitting in the chair no matter what, absorbing it, staying quiet, keeping the peace. But Dorothy never once kept peace with the truth. She showed up for me, which meant she stood between me and the people who hurt me. Showing up isn't shrinking. It's standing. She'd spent her last strength standing up for me from inside a cookie tin. The very least I could do was stand up for her out loud. I closed the ledger. I put the 6-year-old to bed gently for the last time. And in the morning, I called Patricia and told her to file. We filed on a Thursday. I remember, because I took the morning off work and sat in Patricia's office while she walked me through each signature, and everyone felt like closing a door I could never open again. The petition for judicial accounting. The report to Adult Protective Services, documenting the financial exploitation of Dorothy Reyes, and an affidavit. My sworn statement, my name at the bottom. Testifying against my own mother. Patricia slid each page across, and I signed steady. My grandmother's granddaughter with the accountant's hand. And I did not let it shake. When it was finished, she gathered the papers into a folder and said quietly, "You understand there's no undoing this now. Once it's in front of the court, it belongs to the court, not to you." I said I understood. I did understand. I understood I had just ended with my own hand whatever family I had left, and that the one empty chair at the funeral had only been the beginning. I understood my uncle would likely never speak to me again, along with half the relatives I'd grown up around. I understood I was choosing a dead woman over a living family, and that most people would call me cold for it. I drove home genuinely terrified, hands damp on the wheel. But underneath the terror was something I hadn't felt in 22 years, and it took me a while to name it. It was relief. The specific relief of a woman who has finally stopped auditioning for love she was never going to be given, and started standing on solid ground instead. The letter reached Linda on a Monday. She called me that same night, and I let it go to voicemail, then made myself listen. The first 2 minutes were rage. She called me ungrateful, a liar, someone who'd crawled in off the street, and turned the whole family against her. She said Dorothy should have left me exactly where she found me. I stood in my kitchen and let it wash over me, and it didn't cut the way it might have once. Somewhere along this road, her words had lost their edge entirely. Then, mid-sentence, the recording changed. Her voice went soft, wet, pleading. "The fastest turn you've ever heard. Sweetheart," she said. She had never once called me that. That was Dorothy's word. Hearing it in her mouth turned my stomach. "Sweetheart, please. We can fix this. Family stays together. Drop the case and you'll still have a mother. Think about Eli. Doesn't your little boy deserve a grandmother?" And there it was. The oldest hook in the world. The exact bait that would have caught me at any earlier point in my life. You'll still have a mother. As if she'd ever once truly been one. As if the word were a gift she was offering instead of a debt she'd never once paid down. I deleted the voicemail. I did not call back. I understood, finally and completely, that she wasn't sorry. She was cornered. And to a woman like Linda, those two feelings feel identical. The 30 days ran out. And Linda's formal accounting came back to the court exactly as Patricia had predicted, thin, defensive, and full of holes. She'd listed the transfers as caregiver reimbursements and family loans, with no receipts, no signed agreements, no proof Dorothy had ever agreed to a single dollar of it. For a fiduciary, that's not an explanation. That's a confession written in nicer handwriting. In the weeks before the hearing, Patricia and Frank and I built the full file together. We laid the ledger beside the bank statements and matched Dorothy's shaky handwritten notes to the actual transfers, date for date. 300 out on the 4th. There it was on the bank statement. 300 transferred out on the 4th. 500 on the 11th. There it was too. She hadn't just left me grief and a hunch. She'd left me a witness statement in her own handwriting that the bank records confirmed. Line by line, Patricia looked at the finished exhibit and said she'd been practicing law for over 2 decades and had rarely seen a cleaner case. I should have felt triumphant. Mostly I felt tired, sad, and steady all at once. The probate courtroom was small, paneled in warm wood that Dorothy would have run her hand along just to check the grain. I sat at the table on the left with Patricia. Frank sat behind us, and behind him in the gallery sat the relatives. My Uncle Ray, who wouldn't meet my eyes. My aunt, a cousin or two. All of them there to watch, and none of them beside me. Then Linda walked in. Dressed carefully, hair done, moving like a woman attending someone else's misfortune. She had a lawyer in an expensive suit, and the two of them settled in with the confidence of people who had never once heard the word no. The judge called it to order. Patricia presented the petition, and Linda's lawyer stood and did exactly what he'd been hired to do, which was make nearly $400,000 sound like a misunderstanding between grieving relatives. He talked about a difficult recovery, informal arrangements, the general mésalliances of caring for an aging parent. He was smooth. And the whole time he talked, the judge kept glancing down at the exhibit in front of him. Dorothy's shaking handwriting on the left. The bank's cold confirmation on the right. You cannot smooth talk a running total. You cannot charm a spreadsheet. The judge called a short recess before ruling, and that's when they made their move. Linda's lawyer caught Patricia in the hallway and asked for a moment alone with me. Against her better judgment, Patricia let me hear the offer, standing right beside me the entire time. It was surgical. Linda would return a portion of the money, not all of it. And this was the sweetener. She would sign Dorothy's house back over to me. My house, the porch, the oak trees, the light she'd turned off. In exchange, I would withdraw the criminal referral, drop the affidavit, and sign a confidentiality agreement. Then Linda herself stepped into the hallway. Because she couldn't help herself, softened her whole face. and reached for my hand. "Take the house, sweetheart," she said. "Let's put this behind us. You'll still have a mother." I stood there and felt the exact shape of the trap, because it was built entirely out of everything I'd ever wanted as a child. The house, peace, a mother, even a terrible one, instead of no one at all. Everything 6-year-old me had once prayed for, offered to me on a hallway floor in exchange for one small thing. My silence. I looked at my mother's outstretched hand. I looked at Patricia, who said nothing, who let it be entirely mine to decide. I felt two futures pulling at me at once. I took my hand back. "No," I said. Just the one word, quiet, the way Dorothy had always taught me to say the important things. My mother's face went blank. Then furious, because in her entire life, no one had ever handed her a house and gotten a no in return. We went back into the courtroom. And when Patricia offered the exhibits into the record, I asked if I could speak, and the judge allowed it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. I stood and laid it out the way I lay out an audit for any client. Plainly in order, no heat. I read Dorothy's own words first. "Money's tight and I don't know why. She thinks I'm too far gone to count. I'm not. I just can't stop her." Then I matched each line to the bank's confirmation, transfer by transfer, all the way to the certificate of deposit cashed out while she was too unsteady to sign her own name properly. All the way to $390,000. I told the court that money had never been mine to want, and I wasn't there to claim it. I told them my grandmother had meant that certificate of deposit for something good, and that I was asking the court to see it returned so it could go toward elderly people with no one left to show up for them. Not to me, not to her house, which I would be donating in full to an elder care charity in her name. And it was that, oddly, that broke Linda, not the numbers. The part where I gave it all away. She shot to her feet before her lawyer could catch her sleeve. "It was owed to me," she shouted across the room. "I put up with that woman my whole life. It was mine." The courtroom went silent. She'd said it in front of a judge. I just looked at her, calm, steady, done. I understood I had won and lost the exact same thing in the exact same breath. I had my grandmother's honor. And I would never have a mother again. Both at once. Nobody tells you that bill comes as one single payment. The judge didn't need long. He found that Linda had breached her fiduciary duty in the plainest terms he'd seen in years. That the transfers had served her and not the woman she was sworn to protect. And that her own outburst had spared everyone the trouble of proving intent. He ordered full restitution of $390,000. And because he found she'd acted in bad faith, he doubled it in damages. Then he did the thing that couldn't be undone. He referred the matter to the county prosecutor for criminal charges. Financial exploitation of an elder. A felony. I watched it land on her. I watched the confidence drain right out of her posture. She looked at me across that small courtroom, and for 1 second the mask dropped, and I saw something almost human underneath it. Not remorse. I don't believe she had that in her. But fear. Real fear. The fear of a woman who had spent her whole life certain that confidence alone could rewrite any number, and had just learned that it couldn't. I didn't gloat. There was nothing to gloat about. She found me on the courthouse steps afterward, because she couldn't let it end without the last word she'd always taken for granted. Her voice was low and shaking now, all pretense burned off. "I hope you're happy," she hissed. "You destroyed this family. You were never even close to me." I stood there in the afternoon light and felt, for the first time in 32 years, absolutely nothing she could reach. No fear, no hunger for her approval. No 6-year-old still waiting to be chosen. "I didn't take anything from you," I told her. "You took it from her." I just wrote it down. Then I told her, without any heat at all, that I wouldn't be speaking with her again, that she was not to contact me or Eli, and that if she did, my lawyer would handle it. I set the boundary the way you close a ledger that finally balances. Quietly. Done. She opened her mouth to fire back, and there was nothing left to fire at. I walked down the steps and didn't look back. And the strange thing was how light I felt. Not happy. You don't get happy at the end of something like this. But free. Free of a debt I'd been trying to pay my entire life to a woman who was never going to consider it settled. The rest came in the slow, unglamorous way real justice usually does. Linda took a plea rather than risk a jury, and served time for felony exploitation, with restitution ordered on top. My Uncle Ray got his silence, and it cost him his niece. We haven't spoken since, and I've made my peace with that too. The doubled restitution came through in pieces over the following year, and I didn't keep a single dollar of it. Every cent, along with the proceeds from the certificate of deposit, went into a small fund I set up in her name. The Dorothy Reyes Fund for elderly people with no family left to show up for them. It pays for rides to appointments. It pays for someone to simply sit in the chair. Her house, the one Linda tried to sell out from under her, I signed over to an elder care charity. So that the place where a lonely little girl once got her first bicycle would go on sheltering people. No one else came for Dot. My mother once told me, in her own way, that I was never truly hers to claim. She meant it as the cruelest thing she could say. I think about it now every time I sign a check from that fund, and I have to smile because in a strange way she was almost right. I was raised by something better than blood. The kind that shows up and stays. And I grew up to run some of that myself. On the day we handed the house over to the charity, I took David and Eli out there one last time. David had come around long before the hearing ever ended. He told me later that watching me refuse that house in a courthouse hallway was the exact moment he understood he'd married someone with a spine built from the same oak as her. Grandmother Dot, we sat on the porch steps we'd repainted together years earlier. Eli, 5 and fearless, ran the length of the yard the way I used to. The porch light was on, because I'd driven out the week before and put in a new bulb myself. And left it burning. I opened Dorothy's ledger to the very last page and read my son the final line. His great-grandmother ever wrote, "If you're reading this, sweetheart, then I was right about her. And I'm sorry." Eli asked me who she was sorry to. I told him the truth. She was sorry the people who were supposed to love her didn't show up. Then I told him the bigger truth too. That one person did show up her whole life, and that her showing up was the exact reason his mother knew how to stand. He didn't fully understand. He's 5. But he'll have that ledger one day and he'll understand it then. Here's the only thing I know for certain now. Love isn't what people say when the will finally gets read. It isn't a caption on a rooftop, or a card that arrives whenever your birthday happens to be remembered. Love is who is sitting in the chair when no one's watching, and nothing is owed. My grandmother sat in that chair my entire life. And in the end, the only thing she ever asked of me was to show up for her. The exact same way she'd always shown up for me. Showing up is the whole thing. One empty chair. A photo from a rooftop. A leather ledger inside a cookie tin. That's what betrayal looked like in my family. And standing up to it is what finally set me free. If someone in your life has always shown up for you, go tell them today, before the chairs are empty. And if this story moved you, subscribe to Calm Drama Vault, and stay with us. There are more women here who stopped shrinking. Maybe the next one is you.